Thomas Mackenzie stood at the edge of his weathered porch, squinting into the harsh Arizona sun as it painted the desert landscape in shades of gold and amber. The coffee in his tin cup had grown cold hours ago, but he held it anyway, his calloused fingers wrapped around the familiar weight. 3 months had passed since Thunder disappeared, and every morning began the same way, scanning the horizon for any sign of his beloved stallion. Thunder wasn't just any horse. The magnificent black Mustang had been Thomas's companion for 8 years, ever since he'd found the young colt trapped in a flash flood near the Gila River. Most men would have seen a wild animal that needed breaking, but Thomas saw something different. He saw intelligence in those dark eyes, a spirit that matched his own restless soul. Instead of breaking Thunder, he'd earned his trust, and together they'd built something rare in this unforgiving land, a true partnership. The ranch Thomas called home sat in a valley between 2 mesas, 30 miles from the nearest town of Copper Falls. He'd inherited the land from his uncle, a gruff old prospector who'd spent his final years raising cattle instead of chasing gold. Thomas had transformed the modest spread into something respectable, running longhorn cattle and breeding horses that were known throughout the territory for their stamina and intelligence. Thunder had been the crown jewel of his operation, the stallion whose bloodline promised to make Thomas's fortune. That all changed on a sweltering day in late June when the Comancheros came calling. Thomas had been mending fence in the north pasture when he heard the gunshots echoing across the valley. By the time he reached the ranch house, the raiders were already driving his prize horses toward the distant mountains. He'd grabbed his Winchester and given chase, but 1 man against 8 was poor odds, even for someone with Thomas's reputation as a marksman. The Comancheros were a mixed group of Mexican and American outlaws who traded with various Indian tribes, dealing in guns, whiskey, and stolen livestock. They moved like ghosts across the borderlands, striking fast and disappearing into the wilderness where few lawmen dared to follow. Thomas had pursued them for 3 days, following their trail through rocky canyons and across burning desert, but they knew the country too well. By the 4th morning, even Thunder's distinctive hoofprints had vanished in the wind-scoured stone of the high mesas. Sheriff Morrison from Copper Falls had been sympathetic but realistic. "Those boys could be anywhere from Mexico to Colorado by now," he'd told Thomas over a drink in the saloon. "Best thing you can do is file a claim with the territorial authorities and hope someone spots your stock at a horse market somewhere." But Thomas couldn't accept that Thunder was gone forever. The stallion meant too much to him, represented too many years of patient work and careful breeding. More than that, Thunder had been his friend in a lonely land where true friendship was harder to find than water in August. So Thomas had spent his summer searching. He'd ridden to every trading post, every ranch, every settlement within 100 miles, asking questions and showing the sketch he'd drawn of Thunder's distinctive markings. The stallion was solid black, except for a white star on his forehead and 3 white socks, markings that should have made him easy to identify. But no one had seen him, or if they had, they weren't talking. As autumn approached and the desert nights grew cold, Thomas found himself facing a bitter truth. The money from his stolen horses had been meant to carry him through the winter and fund next year's breeding operation. Without it, he was looking at the possibility of losing everything he'd worked to build. The bank in Copper Falls had already extended his note once, and the banker's patience was wearing thin. Standing on his porch in the early morning light, Thomas watched a red-tailed hawk circle lazily overhead. The bird reminded him of Thunder's grace and power, the way the stallion could move across rough country with an effortless elegance that made other horses look clumsy by comparison. Thunder had been born to run free in this harsh landscape, and perhaps that's where he belonged. Perhaps trying to hold on to him had been a mistake from the beginning. The sound of hoofbeats broke Thomas from his brooding. He looked up to see his neighbor, Pete Garrison, riding up the dusty trail that led to the ranch house. Pete ran the spread to the west, a larger operation that had somehow avoided the attention of the Comancheros. The two men had been friendly competitors for years, often helping each other during roundups and sharing information about market conditions. "Morning, Tom," Pete called out as he reined in his horse near the porch. "Thought you might want to know. There's been some Apache activity in the Dragoon Mountains. Couple of prospectors came into town yesterday, said they spotted smoke signals and found the remains of a camp." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. The Apache had been relatively quiet lately, but that could change without warning. The Army had been trying to round up the remaining free bands for months, pushing them onto reservations, where they struggled to adapt to a life so different from their traditional ways. Some groups had accepted this fate, but others continued to resist, launching raids and then disappearing into the mountains they knew better than any white man ever would. "They cause any trouble?" Thomas asked. "Not that anyone's heard about. But you know how it is. They could be scouting for something bigger, or just trying to stay ahead of the cavalry. Either way, you might want to keep your eyes open." Pete's warning carried extra weight, because his own ranch had been hit by Apache raiders 2 years earlier. They'd taken his horses and cattle, but unlike the Comancheros, they'd left his buildings standing and hadn't harmed his family. It had been a professional job, carried out by warriors who took what they needed and left without unnecessary violence. After Pete rode away, Thomas spent the day working on repairs around the ranch house, trying to keep his mind occupied. But as evening approached, he found himself thinking about Thunder again. The stallion's intelligence and sure-footedness would make him valuable to Apache raiders, who prized horses above almost any other possession. What if Thunder wasn't in some distant marketplace but was instead running free with an Apache band in the mountains? The thought should have troubled him, but instead Thomas felt something like relief. If Thunder was with the Apache, at least he was alive and probably well treated. The Apache understood horses in a way that few white men did, seeing them as partners rather than mere property. They would appreciate Thunder's spirit and intelligence, would give him the kind of life he'd been born for. That night, Thomas lay in his narrow bunk listening to the coyotes singing in the distance. The sound reminded him of all the evenings he'd spent with Thunder, the stallion standing alert in the corral while the wild dogs called to each other across the desert. Thunder had always been curious about the coyotes. Ears pricked forward as if he understood their language better than the words Thomas spoke to him. The weeks that followed brought the first real cold of autumn. Thomas worked from dawn to dusk, preparing for winter and trying to build up his depleted herd. He'd managed to buy 3 young mares from a rancher near Tucson, using the last of his savings to give himself a foundation for rebuilding. They were good horses, but none of them had Thunder's presence or intelligence. It was on a crisp morning in late October when Thomas's life changed again. He was checking the water level in the stock tank when he heard something that made his blood run cold. The distinctive sound of Thunder's whinny carried on the desert wind. He'd heard that sound countless times over the years, and he knew it as well as his own voice. Thomas dropped the bucket he'd been holding and stood perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. For a long moment, there was nothing but the whisper of wind through the mesquite trees. Then he heard it again. Thunder's call, unmistakable and closer than before. His hands shaking with excitement and disbelief, Thomas walked slowly toward the sound. As he rounded the corner of the barn, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, standing in the morning shadows beside the corral, was Thunder. The stallion looked magnificent. His black coat gleamed with health, and his muscles rippled under the skin as he moved. But he wasn't alone. Sitting astride his back was a figure that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. An Apache woman, watching him with dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. She was young, perhaps 25, with long black hair that hung in a single braid down her back. Her clothes were a mixture of traditional Apache dress and practical frontier wear, a buckskin shirt decorated with intricate beadwork over dark cotton pants and high moccasins. Most striking of all was her bearing. She sat Thunder with the easy confidence of someone born to ride, her hands light on the simple rope halter that was the stallion's only gear. For what seemed like an eternity, neither of them moved. Thomas felt as if he'd stepped into a dream, or perhaps a vision brought on by too much sun and too little sleep. Thunder was real. He could see the familiar white markings, could smell the horse's distinctive scent on the morning air. But the woman was like something from another world, beautiful and mysterious and completely unexpected. Finally, Thunder took a step forward, and the spell was broken. The stallion nickered softly, the same greeting he'd always given Thomas after a separation. Without thinking, Thomas held out his hand, and Thunder came to him as naturally as water flowing downhill. The reunion was everything Thomas had dreamed of during the long months of separation. Thunder nuzzled his shoulder with velvet lips, while Thomas ran his hands over the stallion's neck and shoulders, checking for injuries or signs of mistreatment. He found none. If anything, Thunder seemed to be in better condition than when he'd been stolen. Throughout this emotional moment, the Apache woman remained motionless on Thunder's back. She watched Thomas's examination of the horse with interest, but no apparent concern. When Thomas finally looked up at her again, she spoke for the first time, her voice low and musical, despite her serious expression. "Your horse came to our camp 3 moons ago," she said in accented but clear English. "He was thin and tired, with rope marks on his legs. He carried the scent of bad men." Thomas felt a surge of anger at the mention of rope marks, evidence of how the Comancheros had treated his beloved stallion. But he also felt gratitude toward this woman and her people for caring for Thunder when he was lost and alone. "Thank you," he said simply. "I've been searching for him since June. I thought I'd never see him again." The woman nodded gravely. "My grandfather said the horse belonged to someone who cared for him. He said Thunder would know when it was time to come home." The fact that she knew Thunder's name sent a chill through Thomas. He'd never told anyone in the Apache community what he called his horse. Yet somehow, this woman's grandfather had understood not just that Thunder had an owner who loved him, but what that owner had named him. "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man," Thomas said carefully. "Is he with you?" "He waits in the mountains," the woman replied. "He sent me to bring Thunder home and to speak with you about many things." Thomas felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. The Apache didn't make casual social calls, especially not to white ranchers. If this woman's grandfather wanted to speak with him, it was about something important, something that would affect both their peoples. "I'd be honored to speak with him," Thomas said. "But first, may I ask your name?" For the first time, the woman's serious expression softened slightly. "I am called Ayana. In your language, it means eternal blossom. My grandfather chose this name because he said I would bloom in all seasons, even when the desert was hard and dry." Thomas found himself smiling for the first time in months. "It's a beautiful name for a beautiful woman," he said, then immediately felt his face flush at his boldness. But Ayana didn't seem offended. Instead, she regarded him with what might have been amusement. "My grandfather also said I would know if you were a good man by how you greeted your horse. You have passed this test." The idea that he'd been tested without knowing it was both humbling and amusing. Thomas had always prided himself on his relationship with his horses, but he'd never imagined it would serve as a character reference with the Apache. "What other tests might there be?" he asked, only half joking. Ayana's expression grew serious again. "That depends on whether you are willing to listen to what my grandfather has to say. These are difficult times for our people. The soldiers push us toward the reservation. But the reservation is a place where Apache spirits die slowly. Some of our young men want to fight until the end, to die as warriors rather than live as prisoners. Others seek a different path. Thomas began to understand why Ayana's grandfather had sent her to him. The Apache were facing an impossible choice: submit to reservation life or fight a war they couldn't win. But perhaps there was a third option, something that would require cooperation between white settlers and Apache bands. "I'm willing to listen," he said. "When Thunder was taken, I learned what it feels like to lose something precious. I wouldn't wish that on anyone, white or Apache." Ayana studied his face for a long moment, as if weighing his sincerity. Finally, she nodded. "Thunder will stay with you tonight. Tomorrow, if you choose to come, you will ride with me into the mountains to meet my grandfather. But know this: once you hear what he has to say, your life will never be the same." As if to emphasize her words, Thunder stamped his feet and snorted, his breath visible in the cool air. The stallion seemed eager to be moving again, as if the long journey to bring his two worlds together had only been the beginning of a greater adventure. Thomas looked at his ranch house, at the familiar buildings and corrals that had been his whole world for so many years. Then he looked at Ayana, sitting proudly on Thunder's back with the vast desert stretching out behind her. He thought about the choice she was offering him: to stay safe in his known world, or to venture into something entirely new and potentially dangerous. But really, there was no choice at all. Thunder had been returned to him by this mysterious Apache woman for a reason. Her grandfather wanted to speak with him about something important enough to risk sending his granddaughter alone to a white man's ranch. And somewhere in the mountains, decisions were being made that would affect the future of everyone in this harsh and beautiful land. "I'll come," Thomas said quietly. "Tomorrow morning, I'll ride with you to meet your grandfather." Ayana smiled then, the first truly warm expression he'd seen from her. It transformed her face completely, revealing the joy and intelligence that lay beneath her serious demeanor. "Good," she said. "Tonight we will rest. Tomorrow we will see what the future holds for all of us." As the sun set over the desert that evening, Thomas stood in his corral brushing Thunder's coat and preparing for whatever lay ahead. The stallion seemed to sense his owner's mixture of excitement and nervousness, nuzzling him gently as if to say that whatever came next, they would face it together. Ayana had accepted his invitation to stay the night, but she'd chosen to sleep outside under the stars rather than in the house. Thomas respected her choice, understanding that it probably reflected both Apache customs and her own caution about being in a white man's home. As darkness fell, he could see her small campfire flickering near the barn, a reminder that his world had already begun to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Dawn came slowly to the desert, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold before the sun finally crested the eastern mountains. Thomas had barely slept, his mind racing with questions about what lay ahead. He'd spent years hearing stories about the Apache, some respectful, others fearful, but he'd never imagined he would find himself riding into their stronghold as an invited guest. Ayana was already awake when he stepped outside, tending to a small fire where coffee was brewing in a battered tin pot. She'd changed into full Apache dress for the journey, a traditional buckskin dress decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the early light like tiny stars. Her hair was no longer in a simple braid, but arranged in the elaborate style of unmarried Apache women, adorned with silver ornaments that marked her as someone of importance within her band. "You slept poorly," she observed as Thomas approached the fire. It wasn't a question. Somehow, she'd been able to tell just by looking at him. "I kept thinking about what your grandfather might want to discuss," Thomas admitted, accepting the cup of coffee she offered him. The brew was stronger than he was used to, flavored with something he couldn't identify that gave it a slightly spicy taste. "Wild mint," Ayana explained, apparently reading his expression. "My grandmother taught me that coffee without flavoring is like a horse without spirit. It will carry you where you need to go, but the journey will not be pleasant." Thomas smiled at the comparison. Everything Ayanna said seemed to come back to horses or the natural world, revealing a perspective that was both practical and poetic. He found himself wondering what other wisdom she carried, what other insights her people possessed that white society had dismissed or ignored. They rode out just as the sun cleared the mountains, with Thomas on one of his mares and Ayanna mounted on Thunder. The stallion seemed completely comfortable carrying his new rider, responding to her subtle cues with the same intelligence he'd always shown with Thomas. It was clear that during his time with the Apache, Thunder had learned to understand an entirely different style of horsemanship, one based more on partnership than control. The trail Ayanna chose led steadily upward, winding through increasingly rugged country that Thomas had never explored. They passed through forests of oak and pine that gave way to rocky slopes dotted with juniper and manzanita. The air grew thinner and cooler as they climbed, and Thomas found himself grateful for the warm jacket he'd thought to bring. "Your people call these the Dragoon Mountains," Ayanna said, as they paused to rest the horses beside a clear mountain stream. "But we have known them as the place where eagles nest, since the time of our great-grandfathers. The rocks here hold power. They remember the songs of our ancestors and the stories of all who have passed this way." Thomas looked around at the towering granite formations that surrounded them, trying to see them through Apache eyes. To him, they were simply obstacles to be navigated, challenges that made travel difficult. But Ayanna spoke of them as if they were living beings with their own memories and purposes. "Do you really believe the rocks remember?" he asked, genuinely curious rather than skeptical. Ayanna dismounted and knelt beside the stream, cupping the cold water in her hands and drinking deeply before answering. "When I was a child, my grandfather brought me to this place and told me to listen. At first I heard only wind and water, but as the day passed and I became very still, I began to hear other things. The echo of old songs, the whisper of stories told around countless fires. The Apache know that everything in this world is connected, that nothing exists in isolation. The rocks, the trees, the animals, the people. We are all part of the same great pattern." Thomas found himself thinking about his own connection to this land, about the years he'd spent learning to read weather patterns and animal behavior, to understand the subtle changes that marked the passing seasons. Perhaps he and Ayanna weren't as different as their background suggested. As they continued climbing, Ayanna began sharing stories about her people's history in these mountains. She told him about ancient hunting grounds and sacred sites, about battles fought against other tribes and later against Mexican and American forces. Her voice carried both pride and sadness as she described how her band had been forced to adapt to an ever-changing world, always trying to preserve their traditions while finding new ways to survive. "My grandfather remembers when the Apache ruled all of this country," she said as they crested a ridge that offered a spectacular view of the valley below. "His father fought against the Mexican soldiers, and he himself has fought against your people's army. But he is also wise enough to see that the old ways cannot continue unchanged. The world is becoming smaller, and all people must find new ways to live together." Thomas was beginning to understand why Ayanna's grandfather had wanted to meet with him. The old Apache leader wasn't just another warrior planning resistance. He was a visionary, trying to find a path forward that would allow his people to survive with their dignity intact. They reached their destination in the early afternoon, a hidden valley so perfectly concealed that Thomas would never have found it on his own. The entrance was through a narrow gap between two massive boulders, opening into a circular basin perhaps 2 miles across. A stream ran through the center of the valley, feeding a small lake surrounded by meadows where horses grazed peacefully. The Apache camp was unlike anything Thomas had expected. Instead of a temporary collection of shelters, he saw permanent-looking structures built with careful attention to both function and beauty. The dwellings were a mixture of traditional wickiups and more substantial buildings that seemed to blend Apache and Mexican architectural techniques. Gardens flourished near the stream, and he could see corrals holding some of the finest horses he'd ever laid eyes on. "This is our winter camp," Ayana explained as they rode toward the center of the settlement. "Here we are safe from the soldiers and the cold winds. My grandfather has worked for many years to create a place where our people can live according to the old ways while also preparing for the new world that is coming." Children ran out to greet them, their eyes bright with curiosity as they stared at Thomas. He was probably the first white man many of them had ever seen up close. But their curiosity was friendly rather than fearful, and several of them called out greetings to Thunder, who whickered in response as if he recognized old friends. Ayana led him to the largest structure in the camp, a building that combined the curved lines of a traditional wickiup with the solid walls of adobe construction. An old man sat in front of the dwelling, his weathered hands working on what appeared to be a bridle decorated with silver conchos. Despite his age, his movements were sure and precise, and his eyes were sharp as they took in every detail of Thomas's appearance. "Grandfather," Ayana said in Apache, then switched to English. "This is Thomas Mackenzie, the man who cares for Thunder with a good heart." The old man set down his work and studied Thomas for a long moment. His face was a map of experiences, marked by sun and wind and the weight of difficult decisions. But his eyes held a warmth that reminded Thomas of his own grandfather, a frontier preacher who had always seen the good in people, regardless of their background. "I am called Nyack," the old man said in careful English. "It means he who wrestles with problems. I have been wrestling with a very large problem, and I believe you may be part of the answer I have been seeking." Thomas dismounted and approached respectfully, removing his hat as he would when meeting any elder worthy of respect. "I'm honored to meet you, sir. Ayana tells me you have something important to discuss." Nyack smiled at Thomas's formal manner. "You have been taught to show respect to your elders. This is good. It shows you understand that wisdom comes with age and experience. Please sit with me and we will speak of many things." They settled onto woven mats arranged in a circle, with Ayana serving as both participant and translator when Nyack's English proved insufficient for complex ideas. Over the course of the afternoon, the old Apache leader laid out his vision for the future. A vision that was both ambitious and pragmatic. The reservation system, Nyack explained, was designed to destroy Apache culture by forcing his people to abandon their traditional ways of life. But rather than choosing between total submission and hopeless warfare, he proposed a third path. What if there was a way for Apache bands to maintain their autonomy while also establishing peaceful relationships with white settlers? "The soldiers want to put all Apache on the reservation because they fear we will raid and steal," Nyack said. "But what if we could show them that we are not their enemies? What if Apache and white people could work together, each benefiting the other?" Thomas listened carefully as Nyack outlined his ideas. The old man envisioned a series of agreements between individual Apache bands and specific white communities, treaties that would allow the Apache to remain in their traditional territories while providing services that white settlers needed. Apache scouts could help track cattle thieves and other outlaws. Apache horsemen could serve as messengers and guides. Apache knowledge of the land could help settlers find water and avoid dangerous areas. "But this requires trust," Nyack continued, "and trust must be built slowly between individuals who prove themselves to be honorable. This is why I asked Ayana to bring Thunder back to you. I wanted to see what kind of man you are, whether you would welcome my granddaughter or turn her away in fear and anger." Thomas felt a deep respect for the old man's wisdom. By returning Thunder, Nyack had created an opportunity to judge Thomas's character while also demonstrating Apache good faith. It was a gesture that spoke to both practical intelligence and genuine nobility. "I'm willing to be part of what you're trying to build," Thomas said. But I'm just one man with a small ranch. How can we make this work on a larger scale? Nyack's eyes twinkled with something that might have been amusement. You think too small, my friend. You see yourself as just a rancher, but I see a man who has built trust with horses that others could not handle. I see someone who has survived alone in hard country, who has learned to read the signs of weather and season. These are the skills of a leader, even if you do not recognize them yourself. Over the following hours, as the sun moved across the sky and the shadows lengthened, Nyack laid out a specific proposal. He wanted Thomas to serve as a go-between, helping to establish relationships between his band and the white community around Copper Falls. Thomas would vouch for the Apaches' peaceful intentions, while Nyack would ensure that his warriors caused no trouble for local settlers. But there are risks for both of us, Nyack acknowledged. Some of your people will call you an Apache lover, a traitor to your own kind. And some of my young men believe that all whites are enemies who should be driven from our land. We must both be strong enough to stand against the voices of hatred on both sides. Thomas thought about the prejudice he would face from some of his neighbors, the suspicion and anger that would greet any suggestion of cooperation with the Apache. But he also thought about the alternative, continued warfare that would eventually destroy Nyack's people while bringing misery to white settlers as well. There's something else, Ayanna said quietly. Grandfather has not told you the full reason why he chose you. Nyack nodded gravely. My granddaughter speaks truly. Thunder came to us carrying more than rope marks from bad men. He carried something else, the scent of kindness, of patient teaching, of love given freely. An Apache warrior named Joaquin found Thunder near death in the desert and brought him to our camp. As Thunder recovered, Joaquin began to understand the horse's nature. He said Thunder had been shaped by a good man, someone who taught rather than broke, who asked rather than demanded. Thomas felt a warmth spreading through his chest at the old man's words. The idea that his relationship with Thunder had somehow communicated his character to complete strangers was both humbling and inspiring. Joaquin is my daughter's son, Nyack continued. He is also one of our finest warriors and a leader among the young men. But he has been wounded in the heart by the death of his wife and child in a cavalry attack on another band. He speaks of taking revenge, of joining those who would fight until the end. I fear that if he chooses this path, many others will follow him into a war we cannot win. Thomas began to see the full complexity of Nyack's situation. The old leader wasn't just trying to find a path forward for his people. He was also trying to save his own grandson from a destructive cycle of vengeance. What does this have to do with me? Thomas asked. Joaquin respects strength and courage above all else, Ayanna answered. If you can prove yourself worthy of his respect, he might listen to other ideas about dealing with white people. But this would require you to demonstrate your skills as a horseman and a man. Nyack leaned forward, his expression serious. There will be a test, if you are willing. Joaquin has challenged any man who would speak for peace to prove himself in competition. Horse racing, shooting, and tests of courage. If you can match him in these things, he will listen to what you have to say about building trust between our peoples. Thomas felt his heart rate increase. He was a good horseman and a fair shot, but competing against an Apache warrior on his home territory was another matter entirely. Still, he thought about Thunder and the trust the stallion represented, about Ayanna's courage in riding alone to his ranch, about Nyack's vision of a future where different peoples could live together in peace. When would this competition take place? He asked. Tomorrow morning, Nyack replied. Joaquin returns from a hunting expedition tonight. But you should know, if you fail to earn his respect, he has sworn to take a war party and raid the settlements around Copper Falls. He believes this is the only way to show the soldiers that the Apache cannot be easily defeated. The weight of responsibility settled on Thomas's shoulders like a physical burden. The peace that Nyack envisioned, the safety of his neighbors, possibly even Joaquin's life, all of it might depend on his performance in tomorrow's competition. "I'll need thunder for the horse racing," Thomas said. "Will that be acceptable?" Ayanna smiled for the first time since they'd arrived at the camp. "Grandfather was hoping you would ask for thunder. It will show Joaquin that you understand the importance of the bond between a man and his horse." As evening fell, Thomas was given a place to sleep in one of the guest shelters. But sleep proved elusive as he lay on the comfortable bed of furs and blankets, staring up at the stars visible through the smoke hole in the roof. Tomorrow would determine not just his own fate, but possibly the future of everyone living in this harsh and beautiful land. Outside, he could hear the quiet sounds of the Apache camp settling into sleep. Children being hushed by their mothers, horses nickering softly in the corrals. The distant sound of drums from a ceremony he couldn't see. It was a peaceful community, Thomas realized, full of people who simply wanted to live their lives and raise their families in safety. Just before dawn, he heard footsteps outside his shelter. Ayanna's voice called softly, asking if he was awake. When he emerged, she was holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing a concerned expression. "Joaquin returned an hour ago," she said without preamble. "He has agreed to the competition, but he is not happy about it. He believes grandfather is making a mistake by trusting any white man." Thomas accepted the coffee gratefully, needing the warmth and caffeine to clear his head. "What can you tell me about him?" "He is the finest horseman in our band and one of the best shots, but more than that, he is proud and angry. The death of his family has left him with a wound that will not heal. He sees cooperation with whites as a betrayal of their memory." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. He could understand Joaquin's pain and anger. The loss of loved ones could drive a man to desperate actions. But he also understood that revenge would only lead to more death and suffering. "Is there any chance he might listen to reason?" Thomas asked. Ayanna was quiet for a long moment before answering. "There is one thing that might reach him. His wife was not Apache. She was Mexican, captured as a child and raised by our people. She became more Apache than many who were born to the tribe, and she taught Joaquin that blood does not determine a person's worth. If you can remind him of her wisdom, perhaps he will remember that not all outsiders are enemies." As the sun rose over the hidden valley, Thomas prepared for the most important competition of his life. The stakes couldn't be higher. Peace or war, cooperation or conflict, hope or despair. Everything would depend on his ability to earn the respect of a grieving Apache warrior who saw him as a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in his world. But Thomas had thunder beside him, and Ayanna's faith to strengthen him, and Nyack's vision to guide him. Whatever happened in the hours ahead, he would give everything he had to prove that a better future was possible for all the peoples of this land. The morning sun had barely cleared the mountain peaks when Thomas heard the sound of horses approaching the camp. He stepped outside his shelter to see a group of Apache warriors riding into the valley, their horses lathered with sweat from hard travel. At their head rode a man Thomas knew immediately must be Joaquin, tall and lean, with the easy grace of someone who'd grown up in the saddle, but carrying himself with the rigid posture of barely controlled anger. Joaquin dismounted near the center of camp and spoke rapidly in Apache to his grandfather. Even without understanding the words, Thomas could hear the tension in the young warrior's voice. This was a man on the edge, someone who'd been pushed to his limits and was looking for an excuse to fight back against the world that had taken everything he loved. Ayanna appeared at Thomas's side, her face serious as she listened to the conversation. "He's telling grandfather about army patrols near the San Carlos reservation. 3 more bands have been forced to surrender this week, and there are rumors that the soldiers are planning to sweep these mountains soon." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. If the army was indeed planning a major campaign in the Dragoons, then time was running out for any chance of peaceful resolution. Joaquin's urgency suddenly made more sense. From his perspective, this might be the last chance to strike back before his people were crushed entirely. The conversation between grandfather and grandson grew more heated, with Nyak's voice remaining calm, while Joaquin's rose in frustration. Finally, the young warrior turned and looked directly at Thomas, his dark eyes blazing with a mixture of contempt and challenge. "So this is the white man who thinks he can speak for peace," Joaquin said in heavily accented but clear English. "You look soft, like a man who has never faced real hardship. What can you know about war and death and loss?" Thomas met the Apache warrior's gaze steadily, recognizing the pain behind the anger. "I know that war makes enemies of people who might otherwise be friends," he replied quietly. "I know that death leaves wounds that never fully heal, and I know that sometimes the hardest fight is the one where you choose not to fight at all." Joaquin's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise at Thomas's respectful tone. But the anger quickly returned, fueled by grief that had festered too long without outlet. "Pretty words," the warrior said dismissively, "but words will not bring back my wife and child. Words will not stop the soldiers from driving my people onto reservations, where they die slowly of broken spirits. If you want to speak of peace, first prove that you are worthy of being heard." Nyack stepped forward, his aged voice carrying the authority of decades of leadership. "The competition will test 3 things," he announced in both English and Apache for the benefit of the gathering crowd. "Horse racing, marksmanship, and courage. Each test will reveal the true character of both contestants." The first challenge was horse racing, and Thomas felt a surge of confidence as he approached Thunder. The stallion had been his partner for 8 years, and they understood each other with an almost telepathic connection. But as he prepared to mount, Joaquin called out another challenge. "We will race without bridles or saddles," the Apache warrior declared. "Let us see how well your horse trusts you when there is nothing between you but your skill as a horseman." Thomas felt a moment of doubt. Riding bareback was one thing, but riding without any kind of headgear required a level of communication with his horse that few men ever achieved. But then Thunder turned to look at him, and Thomas saw something in the stallion's eyes that gave him confidence. During his time with the Apache, Thunder had learned new things about partnership and trust. The race course was a mile-long circuit around the valley, marked by standing stones that had probably served this purpose for generations. Thomas positioned Thunder at the starting line beside Joaquin's mount, a magnificent pinto stallion that looked as wild and untamed as its rider. At Nyak's signal, both horses exploded into motion. Joaquin took an early lead, his pinto stretching out in a flat run that showcased both horse and rider's natural ability. But Thomas wasn't worried about the early pace. He knew Thunder's stamina and intelligence would serve them well over the longer distance. As they rounded the first marker, Thomas felt the familiar joy of riding at full speed across open country. Thunder moved beneath him like flowing water, his powerful strides eating up the ground with effortless grace. But more importantly, Thomas could feel the stallion responding to the slightest shift in weight or pressure, anticipating his intentions before they were fully formed. The race became a study in contrasts, Joaquin's aggressive, dominating style versus Thomas's partnership approach. Both were effective, but as they entered the final stretch, Thunder's superior conditioning and the trust between horse and rider began to tell. The gap slowly closed, then disappeared entirely as the 2 horses ran neck and neck toward the finish. In the end, it was Thunder's intelligence that made the difference. As they approached the final marker, the stallion seemed to sense his rider's need for just a little more speed and found reserves that even Thomas hadn't known existed. They crossed the finish line half a length ahead of Joaquin's pinto. The watching Apache erupted in cheers and calls of appreciation for both riders. But Thomas's attention was focused on Joaquin, who was studying him with a new expression, one that held grudging respect alongside the lingering anger. "Your horse runs well for you," the warrior said simply. "But racing is not warfare. Let us see how you shoot when lives depend on your aim." The marksmanship contest was more complex than Thomas had expected. Instead of simply hitting stationary targets, competitors had to demonstrate practical skills, shooting from horseback, hitting moving targets, and making accurate shots under pressure. Joaquin's Winchester was a work of art, its stock decorated with silver inlay and its action worn smooth by years of use. Thomas's rifle was more utilitarian, but he'd spent countless hours practicing with it during the lonely months when he'd searched for thunder. The first challenge was hitting clay pots thrown into the air while riding at full gallop. Both men were deadly accurate, shattering target after target with mechanical precision. The second test involved shooting at wooden targets shaped like human silhouettes, placed at varying distances and partially concealed behind rocks and trees. This was clearly meant to simulate combat conditions, and Thomas felt the weight of its implications. These weren't just shooting skills, they were warrior skills, the difference between life and death in a hostile world. Again, both men performed flawlessly. Joaquin's shots were quick and instinctive, the product of a lifetime spent in constant danger. Thomas's were more deliberate but equally accurate, each shot carefully aimed and precisely placed. By the end of the second test, they were tied in points. The final shooting challenge was unlike anything Thomas had ever faced. A young Apache warrior on horseback would ride across the valley at full speed, carrying a small target on a long pole. The shooters would have one chance each to hit the target while it moved at maximum speed across uneven terrain. Joaquin went first, his shot ringing out just as the target reached the most difficult part of its path. The bullet struck dead center, and the watching crowd cheered his skill. Now it was Thomas's turn, with the pressure of knowing that a miss would end his chances of earning the warrior's respect. Thomas forced himself to relax, drawing on years of hunting experience that had taught him to wait for the perfect moment rather than rushing a difficult shot. The target was moving fast, but he could read its path, could anticipate where it would be in the split second it took his bullet to travel the distance. He squeezed the trigger gently, feeling the rifle buck against his shoulder. For a moment that seemed to last forever, the bullet tracked across the valley. Then it struck the target with a sharp crack that echoed off the surrounding rocks. The silence that followed was broken by Nyak's voice, speaking in Apache. Thomas couldn't understand the words, but he could see their effect on the gathered crowd. Heads nodded in approval, and he heard the word Pindalik Oyi, white eyes, spoken with respect rather than contempt. "My grandfather says you shoot like a man who has faced death and learned from it," Ayana translated quietly. "This is high praise from someone who has fought in many battles." But Joaquin wasn't finished testing Thomas's worthiness. "Shooting and riding are skills that can be learned by any man with enough time and practice," the warrior said. "But courage, true courage, can only be tested when there is real danger." The final challenge was announced as a test of horsemanship, but Thomas quickly realized it was much more than that. A young stallion had been brought up from the Remuda, a magnificent bay that had never been ridden, his eyes wild with fear and defiance. Both contestants would attempt to not just mount the horse, but to gentle him enough that he would accept a rider willingly. "This horse was captured from a wild band last spring," Joaquin explained. "He has fought every attempt to break his spirit. The man who can earn his trust will prove himself worthy of leading others." Thomas approached the young stallion slowly, his mind racing. This wasn't about domination or breaking. It was about communication, about building trust with a creature that had every reason to fear and hate human contact. He thought about his early relationship with Thunder, about the patience and respect that had eventually overcome the young horse's wild instincts. Joaquin went first, demonstrating the traditional Apache method of horse training. His approach was firm but respectful, using voice and body language to establish his authority while never resorting to violence or intimidation. It was impressive to watch, a master horseman working with an animal that matched his own fierce independence. But the young stallion wasn't ready to surrender his freedom. After several attempts, Joaquin managed to get a rope around the horse's neck and even to touch his flanks, but mounting was impossible. The bay reared and struck whenever anyone tried to get close to his back, his eyes rolling white with panic and rage. When Thomas's turn came, he tried a different approach. Instead of immediately attempting to control the horse, he simply stood nearby and talked to him in the same quiet voice he'd used with Thunder years earlier. He spoke about the mountains and the wind, about the freedom of running across open country, about the partnership that was possible between horse and rider. The watching crowd grew restless as minutes passed without any apparent progress. But Thomas could see small changes in the stallion's behavior, the ears that gradually turned toward his voice, the muscles that slowly relaxed, the wild eyes that began to focus on him with curiosity rather than pure fear. When Thomas finally stepped closer, the horse didn't retreat. When he held out his hand, the stallion actually stretched his neck forward to investigate. And when Thomas began to run his hands along the horse's neck and shoulders, the young animal stood still, trembling but not pulling away. The moment when Thomas swung onto the stallion's back was electric with tension. For several heartbeats, horse and rider remained motionless, each assessing the other. Then, slowly, the young stallion took a step forward, then another. Within minutes, they were moving around the enclosure at a smooth walk, the horse's head high but no longer showing signs of panic. The watching Apache erupted in amazed chatter. Even Nyack looked surprised at how quickly Thomas had gentled the wild horse. But the real victory was visible in Joaquin's face. The anger and contempt had been replaced by something like wonder. "How did you know to speak to him like that?" the warrior asked as Thomas dismounted and released the young stallion. "Most white men try to break horses through force." "My grandfather taught me that respect works better than fear," Thomas replied. "He said that anything you have to break wasn't really yours to begin with. You were just borrowing it until it found the strength to leave." Something shifted in Joaquin's expression at those words. For the first time since arriving in camp, the rigid anger in his posture softened slightly. "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man. Was he a warrior?" "He was a preacher," Thomas said. "But he fought in a war when he was young, and he said it taught him that the strongest victory was the one where nobody had to die." Joaquin was quiet for a long moment, staring at the young stallion who was now grazing peacefully nearby. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, less aggressive than before. "My wife used to say something similar. She said that strength was not about how much pain you could cause your enemies, but about how much pain you could bear without becoming like them." He looked directly at Thomas. "I had forgotten her words until just now." Nyack stepped forward, his weathered face creased with satisfaction. "The tests are complete," he announced. "Thomas Mackenzie has proven himself worthy of respect as a horseman, a marksman, and a man of courage. More importantly, he has shown that his heart seeks understanding rather than dominance." But Joaquin held up a hand. "With respect, grandfather, the tests have shown his skill and his character. But they have not answered the most important question. Can we trust him to keep his word when it becomes difficult? Can we trust him to stand with us when his own people turn against him?" It was Ayanna who answered, stepping forward to stand beside Thomas. "He has already taken that risk by coming here. He has already chosen to see us as people rather than enemies. And he has already proven that he values justice more than the approval of men who judge by the color of skin rather than the content of character." Thomas felt a surge of gratitude for her support, but he also knew that Joaquin's concerns were valid. Making promises was easy. Keeping them when the cost became high was another matter entirely. "I can't prove my trustworthiness with words," Thomas said honestly. "I can only promise to try and ask for the chance to demonstrate it through my actions. I know there will be people in Copper Falls who won't understand what we're trying to build, but I also know there are good people who are tired of living in fear, who would welcome the chance for peace if they believed it was genuine." Joaquin studied him for another long moment, then nodded slowly. "I will not take a war party to raid the settlements," he said finally, "but neither will I promise to trust easily. Trust must be earned on both sides, through small steps and careful testing." The relief Thomas felt was overwhelming. The immediate crisis had been averted. There would be no devastating raids, no cycle of revenge and retaliation that would destroy any chance for peace. But he also understood that this was just the beginning of a long and difficult process. Over the following days, Thomas remained in the Apache camp, working with Nyack and Joaquin to develop specific plans for building relationships with the white community. They identified several immediate opportunities. Apache scouts could help track the Comanchero bands that plagued both communities. Apache horsemen could carry messages between remote ranches, and Apache knowledge could help settlers find reliable water sources. But more importantly, they began to build personal relationships based on mutual respect and shared challenges. Thomas learned about Apache customs and history, while sharing his own knowledge of ranching and the broader political situation in the territory. Joaquin proved to be not just a fierce warrior, but also a thoughtful leader who genuinely cared about his people's future. And through it all, Thomas found himself growing closer to Ayanna. She served as translator and cultural guide, but also as a bridge between two worlds that had been enemies for too long. Her intelligence and compassion helped him understand the Apache perspective in ways that went far beyond language. On his final evening in the hidden valley, Thomas sat with Nyack beside the central fire, watching the stars emerge in the desert sky. Thunder grazed nearby, completely at home in this place where two cultures were learning to meet as equals. "You will face many challenges when you return to your own people," the old Apache leader said quietly. "Some will call you a traitor for working with us. Others will try to use what we build for their own purposes. The path of the peacemaker is always difficult." Thomas nodded, understanding the truth of those words. But he also felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life since Thunder's disappearance. The stallion's return had been more than just the restoration of a beloved horse. It had been the beginning of something larger and more meaningful than anything he'd imagined. "I'll do everything I can to make this work," he promised. "Not just for my own people or yours, but for everyone who calls this land home." The journey back to his ranch took 2 days, with Ayanna riding beside him as an official envoy from Nyack's band. They traveled slowly, both reluctant to end their time together in the peaceful mountains. But as they crested the final ridge and saw Thomas's buildings in the valley below, they both knew that the real work was just beginning. Sheriff Morrison was waiting at the ranch house, his face grim with concern. "Tom, where the hell have you been? There have been reports of Apache activity all through these mountains. I was about to organize a search party." Thomas dismounted and helped Ayanna down from Thunder's back, noting how the sheriff's hand moved instinctively toward his gun when he saw her. It was exactly the kind of prejudice and fear that would make their mission difficult. "Sheriff Morrison," Thomas said calmly, "I'd like you to meet Ayanna, daughter of Chief Nyack of the Dragoon Apache. She's here as an envoy to discuss ways our communities might work together for mutual benefit." The sheriff's jaw dropped as he stared at the two of them. "You brought an Apache woman to your ranch? Tom, have you lost your mind? When word of this gets out—" "Word is supposed to get out," Thomas interrupted. "That's the whole point. We're going to show people that Apache and whites can work together as allies instead of enemies." What followed was a long and sometimes heated discussion around Thomas's kitchen table. Sheriff Morrison raised every objection Thomas had expected, and several he hadn't thought of. But gradually, as Ayanna demonstrated her intelligence and Nyak's proposals were explained in detail, the sheriff's resistance began to weaken. The breakthrough came when Ayanna mentioned that Apache scouts had observed the Comanchero band that had stolen Thomas's horses. They were still operating in the area, and with Apache help, they could be tracked down and captured. "You're saying your people would help us catch those bastards who've been raiding our ranches?" Morrison asked, his interest clearly piqued. "My grandfather believes that men who steal from honest people are enemies of all honest people, regardless of the color of their skin," Ayanna replied. "The Comancheros have also stolen from Apache camps. We have as much reason to want them stopped as you do." By the time the sun set, they had the framework of an agreement. Sheriff Morrison would present Nyak's proposals to the town council, while Thomas and Ayanna worked to identify other white settlers who might be willing to participate in the experiment. It wouldn't be easy, and there would certainly be setbacks, but it was a beginning. As the sheriff rode away, Thomas and Ayanna stood together in front of his ranch house, watching the last light fade from the western sky. Thunder grazed peacefully in the nearby corral, no longer the lost horse who had started this incredible journey, but the living symbol of what was possible when different worlds came together in trust and understanding. "What happens now?" Thomas asked quietly. Ayanna smiled, the expression transforming her face with warmth and hope. "Now, we build something new. Something that has never existed before in this land. We build a future where Apache children and white children can play together without fear, where old enemies become new friends, where the strength of different peoples can be combined instead of set against each other." Thomas thought about the long road ahead, about the prejudice and suspicion they would have to overcome, about the countless small steps that would be required to build lasting peace. But he also thought about the trust Thunder had taught him to value, about the courage Ayanna had shown in coming to his ranch, about the wisdom Nyack had shared in his mountain sanctuary. "It won't be easy," he said. "Nothing worthwhile ever is," Ayanna replied, "but we have something that makes even the impossible seem achievable. We have hope, and we have each other." As if in response to her words, Thunder raised his head and nickered softly, the same greeting he'd always given Thomas, but somehow different now, deeper, richer, full of the promise of new adventures ahead. The stallion had brought them together, but what they built from here would be their own creation, as unique and enduring as the love between a man and his horse, between two peoples learning to see beyond their differences to the common ground that united them all.